Hanson.
The Canberra Liberals won't be supporting this legislation in principle today, and we believe it should be referred to a committee for inquiry to sort out what is clearly a complex issue, but also flawed legislation. And I note that there are numerous amendments, not only to be moved by the Greens, but as I understand from the government, potentially by several ministers. I think the fact that there are so many competing amendments on this bill should be sufficient to raise real caution with the legislation, particularly as it stands. And our approach is based exactly on that: reasonable, responsible caution. I don't have a head in the sand, and nor do my colleagues, on this issue, and in no way do we support an overly punitive approach to cannabis use. I have children, and I wouldn't want to see them locked away because they smoked a joint. No one's suggesting that. But equally, I've seen firsthand the devastation that cannabis can cause in some people, and I genuinely fear that making cannabis more available and more prevalent will increase the risk of harm. Now, we have a responsibility to highlight the potential harms of cannabis use and make sure that lives are not ruined, particularly by young people who are naive to the consequence of cannabis use and not just the risks of a small fine. Now, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, I quote, "Ongoing and regular use of cannabis is associated with a number of negative long-term effects. Regular users of cannabis can become dependent, and commonly reported symptoms of withdrawal, including anxiety, sleep difficulties, appetite disturbance and depression." The 2016 National Drug Strategy Household Survey found, and I quote, "significant increase in the proportion of past month and past 12-month cannabis users that reported mental illness and high to very high levels of psychological distress." The AMA found cannabis can cause a 5-fold increase in users developing psychosis. A 5-fold increase, Madam Assistant Speaker. And paternal use can lead to similar risks for unborn children. These are the words that we cannot ignore. And it's extraordinary to have the Minister for Mental Health just basically saying that the jury's out on how dangerous cannabis can be to some people in terms of its links to psychosis. The AMA also points to the negative impact on vulnerable groups such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups. And the AMA rejects the personal recreational use of cannabis and says it should be prohibited. In its position statement on cannabis use and health, the AMA supports the current approach, stating that, and I quote, "the personal recreational use of cannabis should also be prohibited." We had a debate on this issue yesterday saying we should listen to the evidence and the expert advice, and this is a government that is going to ignore the AMA and a wealth of academic research on this issue. Let me quote from a traumatised mother who contacted my office, whose son's life was destroyed by cannabis. Let me quote from what she said. "I have a son aged 38. He was an excellent student, a high achiever with good prospects for a successful life. At the age of 19, he and his friends thought it was cool and became cannabis users. After one particular time, my son overindulged and became psychotic, developing schizophrenia. That's almost 20 years ago. Since 1999, he's been incapable of working, has no friends, and has a very poor quality of life. His psychiatrist told us that 1 in 10 cannabis users were likely to develop short-term psychotic illnesses, many going on to develop schizophrenia. And that mother implored me not to support this legislation that will make cannabis use more prevalent in our community. Madam Assistant Speaker, I also have personal experience of a friend who became violent towards his wife and threatened to kill her during a psychotic episode we understand was triggered by cannabis use, and I've heard of many similar stories. In the recently released book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness and Violence, Alex Berenson exposes the high incidence of violent behaviour caused by cannabis. He cites numerous studies which all point to cannabis as contributing to increased violence, including domestic violence. And I'd like to quote from an extract of a particularly harrowing tale, and this is a media article that was released on the 5th of May 2017. titled Cairns Children Killings, Does Extended Cannabis Use Play a Role in Psychosis? When Cairns' mother, Rena Thaiday, killed 8 children in 2014, she'd been clean of cannabis for months. But a psychiatrist found her prior long-term use may have triggered the violent schizophrenic episode. A widely held view within the medical and social work community in Australia that there is a link between extended use of cannabis and psychosis. While most research is careful not to draw causal links, a study by the University of Queensland followed more than 3,800 21-year-olds for almost 3 decades, revealed individuals who used cannabis for 6 or more years had a greater risk of developing psychotic disorders or symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. The same document outlined how smoking cannabis at a younger age, more than 3 times a week, could increase an individual's risk for schizophrenia up to 6 times. The Salvation Army's Brisbane Recovery Service Centre Program Manager, Leon Gordon, said, "Anecdotally, before ICE became an issue, we saw that people in their early to mid-30s who were straight cannabis users came in quite damaged," he said. He said there is still a lack of awareness about the toll marijuana can have on someone's health. In most cases, they're no different from anyone else, but the long-term heavy users can be quite withdrawn and paranoid. The idea that it's a drug that you can stop using straight away is naive. That's not our experience. And I've done research on a range of academic articles, and I quoted from one recently, and I'll quote from some others here. And this is from World Psychiatry in 2008, over a decade ago. Cannabis use and the risk of developing a psychotic order. The consistent finding of an association between cannabis use and psychosis makes chance an unlikely explanation of the association, and there are also now a number of prospective studies showing that cannabis use often precedes psychosis. The strongest evidence that cannabis use is a contributory cause of schizophrenia comes from longitudinal studies of large representative samples of the population who have been followed over time to see if cannabis users are at a higher risk of developing schizophrenia. The earliest such study was a 15-year prospective investigation of cannabis use and schizophrenia in 50,465 Swedish conscripts. The study found that those who had tried cannabis by the age of 18 were 2.4 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than those who had not, and the risk of diagnosis increased with the frequency of cannabis use. Now, I tabled that report, the full report, last week in the debate that we were having, and I encourage members to read it for their information. But to suggest, as Mr Rattenbury did, that the jury's out, that the evidence isn't significant, to ignore the warnings of the AMA in their submission to Mr Pedersen's bill from the Minister for Mental Health is simply outrageous. And what compounds that, Madam Assistant Speaker, is that we've got the Greens out there campaigning with advertising material published by Mr Rattenbury saying, "Welcome to the party," with a picture of young people sitting around enjoying themselves, I imagine. That is a grossly irresponsible thing for the Minister for Mental Health to do when we have warnings from so many people, including the AMA, that the use of cannabis can cause a 5-fold increase in psychosis. Yeah. And what's Mr Rattenbury, the Minister for Health's response? Welcome to the party, as part of Greens advertising material. So people that point to the relatively limited harm of cannabis compared to legal products like alcohol and cigarettes, I think need to acknowledge that a significant part of the reason is the lower rates of cannabis use because it's prohibited. The genie is out of the bottle on tobacco. Why do we want to go there with cannabis? Based on the experience with alcohol and cigarettes, legalising cannabis will actually increase rates of harm. The other argument being used for legalising cannabis is that people are being caught up in the criminal justice system and young lives are being permanently wrecked. And that's just not true in the ACT. It's not true. Under current law, small personal use is already decriminalised. It's already the most tolerant, progressive laws in the country, and we support the existing laws. But we must balance reasonable laws with reasonable protections, and the current laws are just that. They're reasonable and they're responsible. They strike the right balance. Now, the hodgepodge mess of laws before us that are going to be subject to a whole bunch of amendments, laws that we're not even going to get through the in-principle debate on today because we're still awaiting these laws to be, the amendments to be, I suppose, drafted or tabled. We haven't even seen them yet. These laws, as they sit before us, are neither responsible nor reasonable. For example, there's little consideration that I can see about the very problematic issue of interaction with Commonwealth laws. Section 109 of the Constitution states that where a law of a state is inconsistent with the laws of the Commonwealth, Commonwealth laws will prevail and the state law will be invalid. And there is a clear conflict in the case of this bill. And I quote from advice that we received from the ACT Law Society. The Society considers that Clause 6 could be inconsistent with Section 308 of the Criminal Code Act 1995, the Commonwealth Act. As Section 308 states that the possession of a substance that is a controlled drug, cannabis, is an offence. Clause 6 could have no effect insofar that it legalises the possession of 50 grams or less of cannabis. In our view, even if Clause 6 is not inconsistent with Section 308, a person who possesses 50 grams or less of cannabis could still be charged with the Commonwealth offence of possessing a substance that is a controlled drug. Now, that's a legal issue that's been raised with this bill. And I understand there are other concerns from the government. The Law Society and commentators in public debate have questioned how this bill interacts with drug driving laws. As I noted recently, I think in the debate last week, that cannabis behind alcohol is the second most prevalent drug when it comes to road fatalities. Do we want to increase the consumption of cannabis? Why do we want to do that? There's also been problems with the definitions of cultivation if there are multiple people in the house. And I think the government has recognised that this is problematic. How many plants are permitted? How many can you have? Is it going to mimic a grow house? What about the fact when the plants themselves contain more than the 50 grams, which is permitted by law? And the Law Society made comments on this in their advice. They say, under the bill, a person who legally cultivates 1 to 4 cannabis plants may unintentionally contravene Clause 6, as an individual cannabis plant can harvest more than 50 grams of cannabis. Now, how does that operate? Again, we don't know. That's not been answered. It's more area of confusion in this bill. And it would be a farce if it was legal to have a large cannabis plant in a house, but illegal to take an amount off it weighing more than 50 grams. Now, what about people who have drug trafficking convictions? So people that have drug trafficking convictions allowed to do this hydroponically if Mr Rattenbury gets his way. So a criminal gang, who knows, maybe one of the outlaw motorcycle gangs that are flourishing in this town, can establish a house. They can have a number of members residing in that establishment, each have 4 plants each. These are people with criminal convictions for drug trafficking, and they can grow it hydroponically if Mr Rattenbury has his way. And the police would be powerless to do anything. The police would be powerless to do anything about little grow houses establishing everywhere. I'm sure there would be crime gangs in New South Wales and elsewhere that would see the opportunity here that they can rent a house, they can move a whole bunch of people in, maybe 5 people, grow 20 plants hydroponically, and the police are powerless to do anything. And there you've got a grow house in Canberra, a legal grow house under Mr Pedersen's bill. And that's what he wants. That's what this law allows. Now, is that a good thing, Madam Assistant Speaker? Maybe Mr Pedersen thinks that's a good thing, because that is what the law allows. And if you were a criminal cartel, you'd be looking at this as an opportunity. You'd say, right, in the ACT, this is something we can do. We try and do this in New South Wales or elsewhere, there'll be some people knocking on our door. But in the ACT, we'll just move 5 people in, rent the house, grow it hydroponically as long as Mr Rattenbury gets his way, and we've got all these big plants full of THC. We can bag it and tag it and send it over the road and sell it. And there's nothing the police will be able to do while those plants are growing. So, Madam Assistant Speaker, they're just a couple of examples of where these laws haven't been thought through. And I question why it is that we will not send these laws to committee. We send many laws to committee in this place. We hear often from the Greens how important it is that we use the committee process. I think there are legal complexities here that need to be addressed, raised by the Law Society, by the Australian Federal Police Association, and it would seem by the government. There are certainly medical issues that need to be considered, as have been raised by the AMA and is related in academic research. And disturbingly, when I asked Mr Pedersen for a copy of the submissions he'd received to his bill, he's refused to give them to me. So where are the submissions that Mr Pedersen got to his bill? Because the only one that we've seen is the one that the AMA released that said we don't support this and raised all of the issues. If this is open government and Mr Pedersen's got nothing to hide, why are we not seeing that? Now, there might be individuals that don't want to incriminate themselves, and I'm not interested in that. We can redact the details of any individuals. But why wouldn't Mr Pedersen, in tabling this bill, say, look, these are the submissions, this is where the evidence is? Why doesn't he want that released? Why don't we have that before a committee to look at the evidence so we can make sure if this is going to be legalised, as is the desire of the government and the Greens, that we do so in a way that causes the minimum amount of harm and acknowledges the effect on young people and the effects of psychosis, that doesn't endorse things like let's join the party, that refutes the fact that smoking dope, particularly for young people, is a big party. It isn't. Five-fold increased rates in psychosis, and examines the issues like grow houses that would be eminently legal under this, and people with criminal convictions for drug trafficking would be able to grow multiple plants, potentially hydroponically, if Mr Rattenbury gets his way. Now, a good strategy for drugs, dealing with drugs, has to involve three elements. It has to control supply and demand and acknowledge harm minimisation. And I believe, as do my colleagues, that the current laws strike that balance well. What these laws will do is encourage young people, particularly, to consume cannabis. It'll become a legal product. There'll be no consequences in terms of actions on them. But the consequences will be dire for people down the track. Because what we will see is more people use cannabis, more people will be affected by it, more people will develop psychosis. And I think that is a tragedy. So we don't have a punitive approach. What we want to do is reduce harm. What we want to do in the opposition is make sure that young people are not damaged. And I reject this rush to ram through legislation that is a hodgepodge, that is subject to numerous amendments, that is subject to a raft of criticism, even from people that support it. Even from people that support it say there are concerns with the way the legislation is drafted. So I foreshadow that when this bill is adjourned at some stage today, before we even vote on it, as I understand, I will then move that we have a look at this in a committee, do it deliberatively, do it properly, because I do not see what the rush is. I'm not sure why it is that the Labor Party and the Greens seem to think that this is something that we should ram through, given the concerns that have been raised by the community and the genuine risks apparent, particularly for young people, in the consumption of increased rates of cannabis.